The scent of burnt toast usually signaled a household failure, but in the residence of Dr. Edward Toke, it was the smell of expensive Arabica and the sharp, sterile tang of high-gloss mahogany cleaner. Precision was the religion of this house. Mary adjusted the placement of the silver spoon by exactly 2 millimeters. It was a habit, a surgical tick she couldn't excise. For 5 years, Mary had treated her marriage like a complex post-operative recovery, patient, meticulous, and entirely selfless. She sat at the breakfast table, the morning sun through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their suburban manor illuminating the pages of the International Journal of Cardiovascular Surgery. Beside her lukewarm tea lay Edward's latest draft for the National Medical Symposium. To the untrained eye, the paper was a masterpiece. To Mary, it was a patient with a hidden, leaking aneurysm. She picked up a red pen. Her movements were fluid, devoid of the tremors that usually plagued those who had left the operating theater years ago. With a few swift strokes, she crossed out a paragraph on aortic dissection. Diagnosis, redundant. Prognosis, fatal to the reader's interest. She scribbled a note in the margin, citing a longitudinal study from a Swiss lab that hadn't even been translated into English yet. She knew the data because she had helped analyze it in a late-night correspondence with her old mentor, John, while Edward was asleep, dreaming of fame. The heavy thud of Italian leather shoes echoed on the marble stairs. Edward descended, his silk tie knotted with the kind of perfection that only a man obsessed with his own reflection could achieve. He didn't look at Mary, he looked at the coffee pot. "The board is meeting at 10, Edward said, his voice a practiced baritone, the kind he used to deliver bad news to patients' families to make himself seem more empathetic. "If I secure this chief of surgery position, Mary, we'll need to upgrade the guest house. My mother will be visiting more often." Mary didn't flinch. She pushed the journal toward him. "You should look at page 12, Edward. Your conclusion on the mitral valve repair is based on a 2018 premise. It's been debunked. I've updated the citations for you." Edward paused, his hand hovering over the coffee carafe. He turned, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the red ink bleeding across his perfect manuscript. He didn't see help, he saw an insult. To a narcissist, a correction is a cardiac arrest of the ego. "You did what?" He snatched the journal, his face flushing a deep, hypertensive purple. "Mary, I've told you 1,000 times to stop doodling on my professional work." "It's not doodling, Edward. It's a correction. If you present that data today, Dr. Miller will dissect you in front of the entire board. It's a basic error in fluid dynamics." Edward let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was a sound Mary had learned to categorize as a toxic symptom. "Fluid dynamics? You're talking to me about surgery?" He slammed the journal down on the table, splashing a drop of tea onto Mary's pristine white silk blouse. "You've been out of the game for 5 years, Mary. You've spent more time choosing the right shade of beige for the curtains than you have looking at a patient. You're soft. You're out of touch. You're a housewife who reads medical journals like they're fashion magazines." Mary looked down at the stain on her blouse. It looked like a small, localized hemorrhage. "Apply pressure," she thought. "Stay clinical. The science doesn't change because I'm in a kitchen, Edward," she said, her voice a flat, steady line, a heart rate monitor at rest. "The data is the data. The data is whatever I say it is." Edward shouted, the volume of his voice vibrating the crystal chandelier above them. "I am the one in the scrub suit. I am the one holding the scalpel while you're holding a whisk. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is? Having a wife who thinks she's still a doctor? You're a Dr. Bwangan, a discarded physician. You couldn't even handle the pressure of the residency, so you hid behind my career. Don't you dare try to claim my brilliance as yours." Mary felt the familiar sting in her chest. In the early years, it felt like a crushing myocardial infarction. Now, it was just a dull, chronic ache, a phantom limb of a love that had already died on the table. "I didn't hide, Edward," she said softly. I stepped back so there wouldn't be two suns in one sky. I thought you needed a foundation. I didn't realize you wanted a floor mat. Edward stepped closer, looming over her. The scent of his expensive cologne felt like a chemical irritant. A floor mat is useful, Mary. A floor mat knows its place. You're a distraction. Stay in your lane. Make sure the dry cleaning is picked up by 4. I have a gala tonight with the board members, and Jane, my patient, the model, will be there. I need you to look, well, try to look like you haven't spent the whole day reading books you no longer understand. He grabbed his briefcase and the journal, the one with her life-saving corrections, and headed for the door. Edward, Mary called out. He stopped, his hand on the brass knob. What? If you don't change that conclusion on page 12, the bleeding won't stop at the podium. It will follow you to the parking lot. Go back to your recipes, Mary, he spat, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was not empty, it was pressurized. Mary sat alone in the vast, cold dining room. The clinical coldness Edward had cultivated in their home suddenly felt like an anesthesia wearing off. The numbness was fading, and for the first time in 5 years, the pain was sharp, localized, and actionable. She stood up and walked to the kitchen island. She didn't reach for a whisk. She reached for her laptop, hidden in a drawer beneath the linens. She opened an encrypted email file. The header read, St. Jude's Medical Group, shareholder access. She typed in a password that Edward didn't know existed. Password, Scalpel01. The screen flickered to life, revealing the internal hierarchy of the hospital Edward was currently driving toward. At the very top of the organizational chart, above the chief of surgery, above the board of directors, was a single name listed as the majority shareholder and chairperson of the Evergreen Foundation. Dr. M. Toke. Edward thought Mary had lost her license because she was weak. He didn't know that she had voluntarily placed it on administrative hold while she took over her late father's global medical empire. She had played the part of the supportive wife so well that he had forgotten she was a predator in her own right. Mary watched the cursor blink. She looked at her red pen on the table. In surgery, when a limb is necrotic, you don't try to save it. You amputate. You cut through the bone, you tie off the arteries, and you discard the rot so the rest of the body can live. She felt a surge of a warmth spreading from her chest to her fingertips. It wasn't the warmth of anger, it was the heat of a laser-guided strike. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. John, she said when the voice answered. Mary? Is it time? The old man asked, his voice thick with anticipation. Mary looked at the red stain on her white silk blouse. It was time to change her clothes. It was time to change the world. The patient is terminal, John, Mary said, her voice lethal and precise. Prep the boardroom. I'm coming in to declare the time of death. She hung up and walked toward the stairs. Each step felt like a suture being pulled tight. She wasn't going to the dry cleaners. She was going to the one place Edward thought she was banned from. She was going to his office. But she wouldn't be sitting in the waiting room. She would be sitting in the throne. St. Jude's Hospital didn't smell like a hospital. At least, not the parts where the wealthy went to hide their sins or tighten their skin. In the VIP wing, the air was scented with expensive eucalyptus and filtered through a specialized grade of ozonizers that scrubbed away the scent of sickness. To Mary, however, the air felt thick with a different kind of pathogen, metastatic arrogance. She stood in the grand atrium, her eyes scanning the familiar marble floors. To anyone else, it was a beautiful lobby. To Mary, it was a poorly designed triage center. She noticed the 3-second delay in the elevator response times and the slight tremor in a junior nurse's hands as she carried a tray of stimulants. Diagnosis, systemic inefficiency. Prognosis, impending structural collapse. She was here because Edward, in his narcissistic haste, had forgotten the surgical clearance forms for his private afternoon clinic, the very forms Mary had spent 3 hours finalizing the night before to ensure he didn't commit a legal malpractice. A commotion erupted near the entrance. The automatic glass doors slid open with a hiss, admitting a gust of humid city air and a whirlwind of perfume. Edward walked in, his arm draped possessively around a woman who looked like she had been carved out of aggressive ambition and expensive silicone. Jane. The patient. Jane was draped in a silk wrap dress that cost more than a nurse's monthly salary. She moved with the calculated grace of a woman who knew the cameras were always watching, even when they weren't. Edward was whispering something in her ear, his face lit up with a genuine warmth he hadn't shown Mary in years. It was the look of a man who had just found a shiny new toy and was eager to show it off. They were met halfway by Dr. Miller and 2 senior board members. These were men Mary had known since she was a child, men who had once looked at her father with reverence. Now, they looked at Edward as the rising star. Mary stepped forward, the folder in her hand feeling like a dormant scalpel. "Edward," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that cut through the hospital's ambient hum. It was the voice of a lead surgeon regaining control of a chaotic OR. Edward froze. His physical reaction was a textbook case of a flight-or-fight response. His pupils dilated, and his grip on Jane's waist tightened. He turned, his face shifting from predatory charm to cold, clinical disgust in a matter of seconds. "Mary? What are you doing here?" he hissed, stepping ahead of Jane as if to shield her from a biological hazard. "You forgot the clearance files for the 2 p.m. procedure," Mary said, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. "Without these, the hospital's insurance won't cover the theater time. I thought I'd save you the embarrassment of a cancelled surgery." Edward's eyes flickered toward his colleagues. Dr. Miller was leaning in, curious. Jane was pouting, her eyes raking over Mary's simple attire, a trench coat over the silk blouse she had tried to clean. To Jane, Mary looked like a ghost from a past Edward had promised to bury. The silence lasted 3 seconds too long. Mary could see the gears turning in Edward's head. He couldn't acknowledge her as his wife, not while Jane was standing there, and certainly not while he was trying to project the image of a high-flying bachelor surgeon to the board. Edward said, his voice suddenly loud and performative, directed at the doctors behind him. He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Thank you. My housekeeper is incredibly thorough. I'd be lost without her management of the domestic logistics." The air in the atrium seemed to drop 5 degrees. Housekeeper. The word hit Mary with the precision of a blunt force trauma. She felt the internal hemorrhage of her dignity, but she didn't let it show. She watched Dr. Miller's eyebrows shoot up. He knew who she was, surely. But Miller was a man who followed the money, and right now, Edward was the one bringing in the high-net-worth patients like Jane. Housekeeper? Jane giggled, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. She stepped forward, looking at Mary with a mixture of pity and condescension. "Oh, Edward, you're right. She does look very efficient. Does she do windows too? Because your guest room was a little dusty this morning." A soft gasp went up from the cluster of nurses near the reception desk. They knew. They had seen Mary at the hospital galas years ago. They saw the cruelty of the lie. Mary's internal monologue was a steady, rhythmic pulse. Maintain core temperature. Focus on the incision. The guest room is dusty because it hasn't been occupied by anyone with a soul in quite some time, Mary said, her voice low and lethal. She stepped closer to Edward, handing him the folder. "And as for housekeeping, Edward, be careful. If you don't keep your own house in order, the foundation tends to rot. And when the foundation goes, the whole structure comes down on the occupants." Edward snatched the folder, his fingers trembling with suppressed rage. "That's enough. Go home, Mary. I'll settle your invoice later." He turned back to his guests, ignoring the ice in Mary's gaze. "Shall we, gentlemen?" Jane needs to be prepped for her refreshment procedure. We're using the new VIP suite on the 4th floor. The 4th floor? Mary asked, her tone conversational but sharp. The one with the experimental ventilation system? Edward stopped. It's the best suite in the building. Don't pretend you know the floor plans better than the chief of surgery. I don't need to pretend, Mary whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. I'm the one who signed the construction permits. Edward ignored her, ushering Jane and the board members toward the private elevators. As Jane walked past, she deliberately bumped Mary's shoulder, leaving a faint trail of her cloying perfume on Mary's coat. Make sure there's dinner waiting when he gets back, Jane whispered with a triumphant smirk. Being a star is exhausting work. Mary stood in the center of the lobby as the elevator doors closed. She was a solitary figure in a sea of white coats and sterile glass. To the observers, she was a discarded woman, a servant sent away with a flick of a hand. But inside, the warmth was no longer a simmer, it was a localized fire. She walked toward the reception desk. Allison, the head nurse who had worked with Mary's father for 20 years, was standing there, her face flushed with indignation. Dr. Mary, Allison whispered, her voice trembling. I am so sorry. How could he? Don't be sorry, Allison, Mary said, her eyes fixed on the elevator floor indicator as it rose to the 4th floor. In medicine, we often have to let the infection reach a head before we can drain it. What do you want me to do? Allison asked, sensing the shift in the air. Mary leaned in, her voice dropping to a clinical coldness. Edward just took his VIP patient to the 4th floor. That wing hasn't passed its final biosafety inspection. The sensors are active, but the scrubbers aren't calibrated for a surgical environment yet. Allison's eyes widened. If he opens a sterile field in there? It's a violation of Protocol 402, Mary finished. And since he's so fond of his housekeeper, I think it's time I did a little cleaning. Mary pulled her phone from her pocket. She didn't call the domestic line. She dialed the hospital's chief compliance officer, a man named Mike. Mike, Mary said as soon as he picked up. I'm in the lobby. I've just witnessed a gross violation of surgical safety protocols by a staff surgeon. I want a full lockdown of the 4th floor VIP wing. Effective immediately. On whose authority? Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. Mary looked at her reflection in the glass of the pharmacy window. She looked like a queen who had just been handed her sword. On the authority of the chairwoman, Mary said. And Mike? Tell security to keep the cameras rolling in the VIP hallway. I want every second of Dr. Toka's unauthorized procedure recorded for the board review. She hung up and looked at Allison. He wanted a housekeeper, Mary said, a dark, beautiful smile finally touching her lips. I'm going to make sure he's swept out with the rest of the trash. Mary turned and walked toward the exit, her pace steady and rhythmic. Behind her, the hospital's red emergency lights began to pulse on the 4th floor. The clinical coldness of the building was about to meet the absolute zero of Mary's revenge. The 4th floor of St. Jude's was bathed in a rhythmic, pulsing crimson. The emergency sirens weren't loud, VIP wings preferred a discreet hush, even during a crisis, but the flashing lights were relentless. They acted like a strobe, catching the sweat on Edward's brow and the mounting hysteria in Jane's eyes. Diagnosis: acute panic secondary to narcissistic injury. Prognosis: unstable. Mary stood near the nurse's station, watching the chaos with the detached interest of a researcher observing a virus in a petri dish. She had initiated the lockdown, but she hadn't left. She wanted to see the exact moment the infection she had married finally began to liquefy. What is the meaning of this? Edward roared, his voice cracking as he slammed his hand against the sealed titanium doors of the surgical suite. I have a patient on the table. This is a breach of my contract. The system detected a biohazard seal failure, Dr. Toke, Allison said, her voice trembling but holding firm under Mary's steady gaze. Until the chief compliance officer clears the floor, no procedures can commence. The air filtration hasn't been certified. Jane, sitting on a gurney in a designer hospital gown that looked more like a cocktail dress, let out a piercing shriek. A biohazard? You mean I'm breathing in germs? Edward, you said this was the best. You said I'd be treated like a queen. She grabbed a lukewarm cup of latte from the side table, a drink Edward had illegally allowed her to bring into the sterile zone, and flung it across the room. The paper cup hit a young trainee nurse, a girl no older than 20, drenching her scrub top in brown liquid and plastic shards. Look at me. Jane screamed, her face contorting. I'm breaking out in hives just being in this low-class hallway. Do something, Edward. Clean this mess up. Edward looked at the sobbing trainee nurse, then at the spilled coffee, and finally at Mary, who was standing perfectly still, her hands deep in her trench coat pockets. His ego, currently under siege by the lockdown and Jane screaming, lashed out at the only target he felt he still controlled. You, Edward pointed at Mary, his fingers shaking with rage. Since you're so obsessed with the domestic logistics and being a housekeeper, make yourself useful. He turned to the supply closet and grabbed a folded, light blue uniform, the scratchy, polyester fabric reserved for the lowest-level hospital trainees. He threw it at Mary's chest. Put it on, Edward commanded. Mary caught the uniform. The fabric felt like sandpaper against her skin, a stark contrast to the Italian silk she wore underneath. Edward, don't be absurd, Mary said, her voice a calm, low-frequency hum. I am not a member of your cleaning staff. You're not a member of the medical staff either. Edward stepped into her personal space, his breath smelling of the peppermint he used to mask his anxiety. You're a Dr. Bwangan, a discarded physician with a lapsed license and zero value to this institution. If you want to stay on this floor during my lockdown, you will earn your keep. Clean up the spill. Comfort the patient. Just treat her, you're nothing but a discarded doctor without a valid license anyway. The words hung in the air, sharper than a grade 4 scalpel. The nurses went silent. Even Jane stopped screaming, a smug, predatory grin spreading across her face. Mary looked down at the blue polyester in her hands. She felt the internal incision Edward had just made. It was deep, designed to sever her last connection to her former life. But as the pain flared, it was immediately cauterized by a cold, brilliant realization. The more he degrades me, the more absolute his downfall will be when the lights come up. You want me to wear this, Edward? Mary asked softly. I want you to realize your place, he spat. You're lucky I let you carry my name. Now, change. Clean the floor. Or I'll have security drag you out in handcuffs for trespassing. Mary didn't argue. She didn't cry. To the shock of everyone in the hallway, she stepped into the nearby staff restroom. 2 minutes later, she emerged. The trainee uniform was 3 sizes too small. It was ill-fitting, cheap, and demeaning. Yet, as Mary walked back toward the coffee spill, she didn't look like a victim. She carried herself with such terrifying poise that the cheap fabric seemed to transform into a ceremonial robe. She knelt on the floor. With a slow, deliberate motion, she began to pick up the shards of the cup. Her movements were surgical, efficient, graceful, and eerily calm. That's better, Jane mocked, leaning back on the gurney. Maybe when I'm done with my surgery, I'll hire you to scrub my toilets at the penthouse Edward is buying me. You have the hands for it. Edward stood over Mary, his shadow eclipsing her. See? This is where you belong, Mary. Under my feet. In the dirt. Don't ever think you're my equal again. Mary stopped. She looked up at him. The red emergency lights hit her face, illuminating a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile of chilling clinical certainty. It was the look a surgeon gives a tumor right before the first cut, not out of hate, but out of the knowledge that the tumor is already dead, it just doesn't know it yet. Why are you smiling? Edward asked, a flicker of genuine fear finally piercing through his arrogance. I just humiliated you in front of my entire department. You should be sobbing. I'm smiling, Edward, because I'm thinking about the law of conservation of energy, Mary said, her voice as smooth as a fresh suture. What? Energy cannot be destroyed, Edward. It can only be transferred. She stood up, the wet rags in her hand, the blue uniform tight across her shoulders. You've spent so much energy today trying to push me down. I'm just wondering, where do you think all that energy is going to go when the pressure is released? Edward recoiled as if she had hissed at him. You're delusional. You finally snapped. Perhaps, Mary whispered. But the lockdown is about to end, Edward. Look at the monitors. The red lights suddenly stopped. They were replaced by a cold, blinding white. The hospital's PA system crackled to life. Attention all staff. The fourth-floor VIP wing is now under the direct jurisdiction of the Office of the Chairwoman. Dr. Edward Toke, please remain where you are. Security and legal counsel are en route for an emergency field audit. Edward's face went from hypertensive red to a necrotic, sickly gray. The chairwoman? Why would she care about a biohazard glitch? Mary dropped the wet rags onto the floor, right onto Edward's polished leather shoes. She began to unbutton the cheap trainee uniform, revealing the white silk blouse underneath. It wasn't a glitch, Edward, Mary said. She took a step toward him, and this time, he was the one who backed away until he hit the wall. It was a biopsy. And I'm afraid the results just came back. What are you talking about? Jane yelled, sliding off the gurney. Who is this chairwoman? Mary turned to Jane, her gaze so sharp it felt like a physical sting. You wanted a treatment, Jane. You're about to get one. But I don't think you'll like the side effects. The heavy titanium doors at the end of the hallway slid open. Mike, dressed in a black suit that looked like a funeral shroud, marched in followed by 4 security guards. He didn't look at Edward. He didn't look at Jane. He walked straight to Mary and bowed his head slightly. The board is assembled in the teleconference suite, Dr. Toke, Mike said clearly. They've seen the footage of the last 10 minutes. They are disturbed. Edward's voice was a ghost of itself. Footage? What footage? Mary reached out and adjusted Edward's crooked tie, her touch as light as a feather and as cold as ice. The housekeeper kept the cameras running, Edward, Mary whispered in his ear. I told you. I'm very thorough with the domestic logistics. She turned and began to walk away, shedding the blue trainee uniform and letting it fall to the floor like a molted skin. Mary! Edward screamed, his voice echoing in the sterile hallway. Where are you going? You can't leave me here. Mary didn't turn back. She didn't need to. I'm going to go sign your invoice, Edward, she called out over her shoulder. Just like you asked. The observation gallery of Operating Theater 1 was the coldest place in St. Jude's. It was a glass-walled cage suspended above the theater floor, a place where students watched masters and where legacies were either born or autopsied. Today, there was no surgery scheduled. The theater below was dark, the robotic arms of the Da Vinci surgical system draped in sterile plastic like silent, chrome ghosts. Mary sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was still wearing the white silk blouse, though it was now wrinkled from the morning's housekeeping. She looked down at the dark operating table, her mind performing a phantom procedure. Diagnosis, necrotic union. Procedure, radical excision. The heavy double doors behind her hissed open. Edward walked in, his footsteps echoing with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a man who believed the world was his personal catwalk. He wasn't wearing his lab coat. He was in a bespoke charcoal suit, his National Chief of Surgery candidate pin gleaming on his lapel like a drop of silver blood. He didn't sit. He stood at the railing, looking down at the empty theater as if he already owned the air inside it. Do you know what they call this room, Mary? He asked, his voice echoing in the hollow space. The arena. This is where men like me prove their worth. And this morning, the selection committee informed me that I am the only viable candidate for the national chair. My appointment is a formality. Mary didn't turn her head. Congratulations, Edward. I hope the chair is as comfortable as you've imagined. It won't just be comfortable. It will be transformative, Edward said, turning to face her. The light from the hallway caught the sharp, predatory angle of his jaw. But a transformation requires the removal of dead weight. A man in my position, a man who will be the face of American medicine, cannot have a discarded doctor for a wife. You are a stain on my resume, Mary. A reminder of a period of my life where I settled for less. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. He didn't hand it to her, he dropped it onto the seat beside her, the sound of the heavy paper hitting the plastic like a gavel. Divorce papers, Edward said, his tone as clinical as a death certificate. And an eviction notice for the manor. I've already had the lock scheduled for change at 6 p.m. tonight. Jane prefers the aesthetic of the West Wing, and frankly, your presence there would be aesthetically displeasing. Mary looked at the envelope. She didn't reach for it. Total betrayal, she whispered, more to herself than to him. It's not betrayal, Mary. It's triage, Edward countered, leaning over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame. In surgery, you don't keep a limb that isn't functioning. You cut it off so the rest of the body can thrive. You haven't functioned as a doctor or a partner in years. You've been a ghost in my house, a shadow at my table. I'm simply making the death of this marriage official. He pulled a fountain pen from his pocket, a gold-plated Mont Blanc Mary had bought him for their 3rd anniversary. He clicked it open and held it out to her. Sign them. Now. If you do it quietly, I'll ensure your severance is enough to keep you in a small apartment somewhere far from the city. If you fight me, I will use every ounce of my new political power to ensure you never work in a hospital, not even as a janitor, ever again. Mary finally looked up. Her eyes weren't red. There was no moisture on her lashes. To Edward's irritation, she didn't look like a woman whose world was ending. She looked like a woman watching a particularly interesting chemical reaction. You're very confident, Edward, Mary said. You believe that by signing this, I am losing everything. You are losing everything, he scoffed. You're losing my protection, my status, and my wealth. Without me, you're just a woman with a stale degree and a stained shirt. You're a footnote in my biography. Mary took the pen. Her hand was steady, a surgeon's hand. Pulse, 60 BPM. Respiratory rate, 12. Emotional state, absolute 0. She opened the folder. She didn't read the legalese, she knew it already. Mike had drafted the original prenuptial agreements years ago, and she knew Edward's lawyers had tried to claw back every cent. She turned to the final page. With a few swift, elegant strokes, she signed her name. Mary Toke. She handed the pen back to him. Edward snatched the papers, his eyes scanning her signature with a glint of triumph. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. Finally. The leash is off. Yes, Mary said, standing up. She smoothed the wrinkles in her skirt. The leash is off, Edward. But you've forgotten one thing about leashes. Edward was busy tucking the papers into his briefcase, a smirk playing on his lips. What's that? They don't just hold the dog back, Mary said, stepping closer to him until she could see the tiny, broken capillaries in his eyes, the subtle signs of his stress and his vices. They also keep the dog from wandering into traffic. Without the leash, Edward, you're just an animal in the middle of a very fast road. Edward laughed, a loud, jarring sound that echoed in the gallery. Still with the metaphors, Mary? Go home. Pack your bags. You have 5 hours before the security team clears the house. He turned on his heel, ready to march out of the gallery and into his new life. Edward, Mary called out. He stopped at the door, impatient. What now? Looking for a final kiss? A plea for mercy? I signed the papers without a tear because I wanted you to feel the full weight of your victory, Mary said. Her voice was no longer a hum, it was a blade. I wanted you to believe you've won everything right at the moment you've lost it all. You think you've just divorced a housewife. You'll find out soon enough that you've actually just signed your own professional death warrant. Edward rolled his eyes. You're pathetic. Enjoy the small apartment, Mary. I'll send Jane's old clothes to you if you need something to wear for your next job interview at a clinic in the slums. The doors hissed shut behind him. Mary stood in the silence of the gallery. She looked down at the dark operating table one last time. Releasing the leash, she whispered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't call Mike this time. She opened a secure messaging app and sent a single word to the board of directors group chat. Execute. Seconds later, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from the hospital's internal server. Notification, official appointment of National Chief of Surgery, vetoed by majority shareholder. Notification, financial audit of Dr. Edward Toke, commenced. Notification, legal eviction of Edward Toke from Evergreen Foundation property, issued. Mary walked out of the gallery, her footsteps light and purposeful. As she passed the nurse's station, she saw the TV monitors in the hallway. A news ticker was already running. Breaking news, St. Jude's Medical Group announces surprise leadership change. Press conference at 4 p.m. Edward thought he was going to a gala. He didn't know he was going to an execution. And the best part? He had given her the pen to sign the order. Mary didn't head for the exit. She headed for the executive elevators, the ones that required a biometric scan. She pressed her thumb to the glass. Identity confirmed, Dr. Mary Toke. Welcome, Chairwoman. The doors opened into a world of mahogany, glass, and power. The housekeeper was done with the dishes. It was time to operate. The click of the front door closing behind Mary was the sound of a surgical stapler finishing a wound. It was final. It was sterile. And it was exactly what she needed. She stood on the gravel driveway of the Toke Manor, a single, battered leather suitcase at her side. It was the same suitcase she had brought with her 5 years ago when she moved in, believing she was entering a partnership of equals. Inside were the only things Edward hadn't paid for, her father's medical journals, her original degree from Johns Hopkins, and her old stethoscope. Diagnosis, total clearance of necrotic tissue. Prognosis, vitality restored. The 6 p.m. sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawn, the lawn Jane would likely be sunbathing on by noon tomorrow. Mary didn't look back at the house. In her mind, the structure was already condemned. At the edge of the estate, parked precisely where the public road met the private drive, sat a black Mercedes Maybach. Its tinted windows were like obsidian, reflecting nothing but the cold reality of the world. As Mary approached, the driver's door opened, and a man in a sharp, charcoal suit stepped out. It was Mike, the man who handled the legal leviathan that was the Evergreen Foundation. Beside him stood John, a man whose face was a map of medical history, his silver hair a badge of 5 decades in the operating room. When they saw Mary, wearing her stained silk blouse and carrying her own bag, they didn't look at her with the pity Edward had mastered. They looked at her with an expression that bordered on religious awe. Chairwoman, Mike said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. He moved quickly to take her suitcase, treating the old leather as if it were a chest of crown jewels. Mary, John whispered, his eyes misting over. He took her hands in his. The 5-year sabbatical is over, then? The lioness has decided the cage is too small? The cage wasn't just small, John, Mary said, her voice reclaiming its original steel. It was infested. I've spent 5 years watching a mediocre man play God with my resources. It's time for a radical reconstruction. The board is waiting at the downtown headquarters, Mike informed her, opening the rear door. But first, we have a scheduled stop. You can't enter a war room looking like a casualty. The limousine pulled into the underground parking of the Aurelius building, a glass and steel monolith that housed the executive offices of the Evergreen Foundation. They didn't go to the lobby. They took a private elevator directly to the penthouse suite. The suite was a masterclass in corporate zen, minimalist, cold, and immensely powerful. In the center of the room, draped over a mannequin, was a three-piece suit in midnight navy. The fabric was a wool-silk blend that didn't just reflect light, it seemed to absorb it. Beside it sat a pair of pointed toe pumps and a briefcase made of matte alligator skin. Mary walked toward the suit. She ran her hand over the lapel. It felt like armor. 5 years, Mary, John said, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. You gave him everything. Your research, your time, your silence. Why today? Because today he called me up, Dr. Bwangan, Mary said, her reflection in the glass beginning to shift as she unbuttoned the stained blouse. He didn't just insult my person, he insulted the craft. He's forgotten that medicine isn't about the man holding the scalpel, it's about the truth of the anatomy. He's become a cancer, John. And as you taught me, you don't negotiate with a tumor. She stepped into the dressing room. When she emerged 10 minutes later, the housewife was dead. The suit fit her like a second skin, the sharp lines of the shoulders giving her a silhouette of absolute authority. Her hair, which she usually wore in a soft, domestic bun, was now pulled back into a lethal, low ponytail. She hadn't put on much makeup, just a touch of obsidian eyeliner and a lip color the shade of dried blood. She looked in the mirror. For the first time in half a decade, she recognized the woman staring back. The glow-up is complete, Mike remarked, checking his watch. You look like the woman who bought 3 hospital chains before breakfast. I don't want to look like I bought them, Mary said, snapping the alligator briefcase shut. I want to look like I'm the only thing keeping them from falling apart. She walked to the executive desk, her heels clicking against the polished marble like a countdown. She didn't sit. She leaned over the desk, her eyes fixed on the dual monitors, displaying the real-time financial health of St. Jude's Medical Group. First order of business, Mary commanded. Mike pulled out his tablet, ready to record. The board is expecting your introductory speech. Forget the speech. I want a full forensic audit, Mary said. Her words were like surgical strikes. I want every penny Edward Toke has spent in the last 60 months tracked. Every research grant he signed, every consultation fee he pocketed, and every VIP discount he gave to his mistresses. John frowned. You think he's been embezzling? He's a narcissist with a model's lifestyle and a surgeon's ego, John. He thinks the hospital's treasury is his personal ATM because he deserves it for being the face of the brand. I want a deep dive into the National Chief of Surgery campaign funds. I suspect he's been using foundation money to lobby the selection committee. If we find proof of financial malpractice, it won't just be a divorce, Mike noted, a predatory smile touching his lips. It will be a criminal indictment. That's the goal, Mike. I signed the divorce papers to release the leash. Now, I'm releasing the hounds. I want his access to the Evergreen Foundation's accounts frozen by midnight. I want his corporate credit cards declined while he's still at his victory gala tonight. And what about the surgery tomorrow? John asked. He's scheduled to operate on a senator's daughter. Mary's eyes turned cold. Suspend his privileges pending the audit results. Cite clinical irregularities observed during today's biohazard breach. If he wants to operate, he can do it in a back alley. He is no longer a representative of this institution. She turned toward the door, her coat draped over her shoulders like a cape. Where are we going, Chairwoman? Mike asked. To the boardroom, Mary said. The directors have been led by a rising star for too long. It's time they were reminded that the star only shines because of the gravity of the planet it orbits. I want to see the look on Miller's face when he realizes who has been signing his paychecks. As they stepped into the hallway, the staff of the executive floor, people who had worked for the foundation for years, stopped what they were doing. They stood and bowed. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement. The Queen was back on the throne, and she wasn't there to grant pardons. Internal monologue: the anesthesia is completely gone now. The pain is gone too. All that's left is the precision of the procedure. The first incision was the divorce. The second is the audit. By the time I'm done, Edward won't just be a Dr. Bwangan. He'll be a medical curiosity, a man who lost his heart, his mind, and his empire all in a single day. Mike, Mary said as the elevator doors closed. Yes, Chairwoman. Make sure Jane's name is added to the audit. I want to know exactly how much of my father's legacy went into her plastic surgery. I intend to reclaim every cent. The elevator descended, but Mary felt like she was finally rising. The shadow of a genius was no longer a shadow. She was the light, and she was about to burn everything Edward Toke had built to the ground. The war room of the Evergreen Foundation didn't look like a place where lives were saved. It looked like a place where they were measured, weighed, and, if necessary, discarded. Located on the 52nd floor, the room was a sterile box of glass and brushed steel. Outside, the city lights of the metropolis pulsed like a digital EKG. Inside, the only light came from a wall of high-definition monitors displaying the biopsy of Edward Toka's career. Mary stood at the center of the room, her navy power suit still crisp despite the late hour. She held a glass of mineral water, but she hadn't touched it. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing blue text of the hospital's internal server. Diagnosis: intellectual parasitism. Pathogen: Edward Toke. Prognosis: terminal reputational collapse. I've spent the last 3 hours cross-referencing Edward's pioneering publications from the last 3 years with the metadata from your home cloud server, Chairwoman, Mike said, his fingers dancing across a tablet. He looked tired, but his eyes held the predatory gleam of a prosecutor who had just found the smoking gun. And? Mary asked. Her voice was a steady, low-frequency blade. It's not just a few shared ideas, Mary, Mike said, his voice dropping an octave. It's a wholesale harvesting. Look at this. He swiped his tablet, and the center monitor flared to life. On the left was a scan page from Mary's private handwritten journal, dated June 2023. It was a complex diagram of a specialized suture technique for neonatal aortic repairs, something she had titled the aortic shielding method. On the right was the lead article from the New England Journal of Medicine, published 6 months later. The title, The Toke Technique, A New Frontier in Pediatric Cardiac Stability. The diagrams were identical. Every measurement, every surgical angle, even the specific grade of polypropylene thread she had recommended in her notes had been transcribed into the article. The Toke technique, Mary whispered, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. The breakthrough that made him the golden boy of St. Jude's. The reason he was nominated for the national chair. He didn't even change the variable names in the statistical models, Mike added, his voice thick with disbelief. He copied your work, Mary. He took your genius, slapped his name on the masthead, and used it to climb over your back. Mary felt a cold, familiar sensation spreading through her veins. It wasn't the searing heat of anger, it was the clinical chill of a surgeon who had just found a massive, hidden tumor during a routine procedure. For 5 years, she had lived in a house built on her own stolen brilliance. She had cooked his meals and straightened his ties while he was upstairs, literally stealing the soul of her professional life. There's more, John said, stepping out from the shadows of the room. He looked older in this light, his face etched with a deep, professional grief. I've been reviewing his surgical outcomes for the procedures where he supposedly used his technique. Look at the mortality rates, Mary. A new set of graphs appeared. The red lines, the ones representing Edward's actual surgeries, were jagged and erratic. He's using your theory, but he lacks your hands, John explained, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. He understands the what, but he doesn't understand the why. Because he didn't invent the method, he can't adapt it when things go wrong on the table. He's had 3 near misses in the last quarter that were scrubbed from the public record by the former administration. Mary walked toward the screen, her hand reaching out to touch the digital representation of her stolen work. He's a fraud, she said. He's not just a thief, he's a hazard. Every time he walks into an or using my name, he's committing a slow-motion malpractice. We have enough to fire him for cause right now, Mike said, standing up. We can strip him of his title and walk him out of the gala in front of everyone. No, Mary said. The word was a finality, a surgical verdict. She turned away from the screen, her eyes locking onto Mike's. If we just fire him, he'll find a way to spin it. He'll play the victim of corporate politics. He'll go to a smaller hospital, take his stolen toke technique with him, and keep hurting people. A simple amputation isn't enough when the cancer has already reached the lymph nodes. What are you suggesting? John asked. I want a total professional deconstruction, Mary said. Her voice was calm, yet it vibrated with an authority that made the air in the room feel pressurized. I don't want to just remove him. I want to dismantle his reputation so thoroughly that his name becomes a synonym for fraud in every medical school from here to Geneva. She began to pace the room, her heels clicking a rhythmic, lethal beat. Mike, I want you to prepare a multi-jurisdictional lawsuit for intellectual property theft. But we don't file it yet. I want the forensic team to recover the deleted drafts from his laptop. I want the timestamps that show he was accessing my private server while I was asleep. Consider it done, Mike said. And John, Mary turned to her mentor. I want you to contact the Ethics Committee of the International Board of Surgeons. Don't tell them who provided the information. Just tell them that the toke technique is based on falsified clinical foundations and that the author lacks the competency to execute his own published theory. Suggest an immediate, unannounced clinical competency review. They'll pull his license within 48 hours, John noted, a grim smile forming on his face. Good, Mary said. But the professional karma needs to be public. He spent 5 years telling me I was a discarded doctor, while he stood on my shoulders to reach the sun. I want him to feel the exact moment the floor disappears. She stopped pacing and looked at the city below. Somewhere down there, Edward was likely at a pre-gala dinner, toasting his own brilliance with Jane by his side. He thought he was at the peak of his mountain. He didn't realize the mountain was made of ice, and Mary was the one holding the heat lamp. Internal monologue, he called me a housewife. He told me I was out of touch. Every time he looked at me across that breakfast table, he wasn't seeing a wife, he was seeing a witness he needed to silence. He didn't just want my support, he wanted my disappearance. But the funny thing about ghosts, Edward, is that they can see through walls. And they can walk through doors you thought were locked. Mary, John said softly. This will destroy him. He'll never work as a doctor again. He'll likely lose his house, his assets, and his freedom if the fraud is severe enough. Mary turned back to him. The light of the monitors reflected in her eyes, making them look like cold, blue diamonds. He chose the arena, John, Mary said. He brought his mistress into my hospital and told me to clean up her mess. He signed the divorce papers and told me to get out of his sight. He wanted a world without Mary Toke. She picked up her glass of water and finally took a sip. It was cold, clear, and refreshing. I'm just giving him exactly what he asked for, she said. A world where I am no longer his wife, his shadow, or his housekeeper. A world where I am simply his judge. She looked at Mike. How soon can we have the board meeting ready? Miller is calling for a vote of confidence on Edward's appointment tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Mike replied. Perfect, Mary said, a dark, beautiful elegance returning to her posture. Let them vote. Let them go through the whole ceremony. Let him get right to the edge of his dream. And then? And then, Mary said, we perform the final incision. She walked toward the door, her silhouette framed by the glowing data of her own stolen life. The shadow of a genius was gone. In its place was the chairwoman, and she was done with the diagnosis. It was time for the treatment. L'Eclipse was the kind of restaurant where the lighting was designed to make diamonds sparkle and secrets disappear. Located on the 80th floor of the city's most prestigious spire, it was a cathedral of excess, all gold leaf, velvet shadows, and the scent of white truffles. For Edward Toke, it was the only appropriate venue to celebrate his transition from mere mortal surgeon to medical deity. Mary sat in a secluded booth at the far end of the terrace, shielded by a wall of lush, tropical ferns. She was waiting for Mike and the lead forensic auditor, but for now, she was an observer. She sipped a glass of vintage Cristal, her eyes fixed on the center table, the throne room, where Edward was currently holding court. Diagnosis: acute narcissistic mania. Symptoms: grandiose delusions, excessive vocal projection, and a complete lack of situational awareness. Prognosis: impending systemic shock. Edward was mid-toast, his glass of vintage Bordeaux raised high. He was surrounded by a circle of sycophants, young residents hoping for a crumb of his favor and senior partners too tired to challenge his ascent. Jane sat beside him, her dress a shimmering gold mesh that left very little to the imagination. She looked like a trophy polished to a high shine, leaning into Edward as if his reflected glory could provide her with a permanent tan. To the future. Edward's voice carried across the hushed restaurant, drawing the eyes of the city's elite. To the national chair, to the evolution of the Toke technique, and to the end of the old guard. Tomorrow, St. Jude's becomes a kingdom, and I intend to be its king. A chorus of a hear, hear, followed. Edward leaned back, his chest puffed out like a bird in a mating ritual. To him, the world was a series of mirrors, and today, every single one was telling him he was beautiful. Mary watched him through the gaps in the ferns. She saw the way he gripped his glass, too tight, a sign of underlying sympathetic nervous system arousal. He was high on the placebo effect of fame. He had no idea that the kingdom he was claiming was currently being liquidated beneath his feet. A waiter passed her booth, and Mary signaled for another bottle of water. As she adjusted her position, the light from the chandelier caught the navy silk of her power suit. Edward's eyes, roaming the room for more admirers, suddenly snagged on her silhouette. Mary saw the exact microsecond the clot formed in his brain. His smile faltered. His eyes narrowed. He whispered something to Jane, who turned and squinted into the shadows of the terrace. Edward stood up, his movements jerky. He didn't just walk toward her, he marched, fueled by the indignant rage of a man who thought he had successfully disposed of a piece of trash, only to find it sitting in his favorite park. Mary? Edward's voice was a low growl as he reached the edge of her booth. Mary didn't look up. She was focused on the bubbles in her glass, analyzing their ascent with clinical precision. I know you're desperate, Mary, but this is pathetic, Edward sneered, leaning his hands on the table. He smelled of expensive wine and cheap victory. I told you to be out of the house by 6. I didn't think you'd spend your last few dollars to follow me here just to beg for a second chance. Jane arrived a second later, her heels clicking like a countdown. Oh, Edward, look at her. She's even wearing a suit. Is she trying to look like a professional? Or did she find a job here? Jane's laugh was like glass breaking in a sterile field. That's it, isn't it? You're working the terrace. Edward, you were right, she really is a housekeeper at heart. Did they hire you to clean the crumbs off the VIP tables, Mary? Mary finally raised her head. She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She looked at Edward and Jane with the same surgical indifference one might use to look at a specimen jar in a pathology lab. I'm sorry, Mary said, her voice a cool, melodic silk. Have we met? The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. Edward's face shifted from triumph to confusion, then to a deep, hypertensive purple. Have we met? Edward barked, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. I'm your husband, you delusional woman. Or did you forget that in the 3 hours since I kicked you out of my house? Mary tilted her head, a small, polite smile playing on her lips, the kind of smile a CEO gives to a slightly confused delivery person. You must be mistaken, Mary said softly. I don't have a husband. I have a legacy, and I have a schedule, but I certainly don't have, whatever this is. She gestured vaguely at Edward's expensive suit, as if he were a poorly executed piece of street art. You're playing games, Jane snapped, stepping closer. You're just bitter because Edward chose a model over a discarded doctor. Go back to the kitchen, Mary. Or better yet, go find the manager. We need more bread at the center table. Jane reached into her gold clutch, pulled out a $20 bill, and flicked it onto Mary's table. There's a tip. Now go get us some sparkling water and stop bothering the important people. Mary looked at the $20 bill. She picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it were a contaminated swab. A tip, Mary mused. How charmingly retro. She stood up. The movement was so sudden and so full of natural authority that Edward instinctively took a step back. In her navy suit and her heels, she seemed to tower over them, her presence filling the space with a weight that Jane's gold mesh could never achieve. Mary didn't look at Jane. She looked directly into Edward's eyes. You look stressed, Edward, Mary said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. Your heart rate is elevated, your pupils are dilated, and your speech is pressured. If I were your doctor, which I'm not, I'd suggest you avoid any sudden shocks. The ego is a fragile organ. When it ruptures, the internal bleeding is difficult to contain. What the hell are you talking about? Edward hissed, but the bravado was leaking out of him. There was something in Mary's eyes, a cold, distant power, that he didn't recognize. Enjoy your dinner, Edward, Mary said, her voice returning to its polite, public tone. And the tip? Keep it. I think you're going to need every cent of it by tomorrow morning. She brushed past him. She didn't push, she simply moved as if he were air, a non-entity in her path. Edward reached out to grab her arm, but before he could touch her, a hand like a vice clamped down on his wrist. It was Mike. He had appeared from the shadows of the hallway, flanked by 2 large men in suits who looked significantly more security than a waitstaff. I wouldn't do that, Dr. Toke, Mike said, his voice a low, legal threat. Assaulting a patron of L'Eclipse would be a very poor way to spend your final night of freedom. Mike? Edward squinted at him. What are you doing here? Why are you with her? I'm with my client, Mike said, releasing Edward's wrist with a flick of disgust. And you, doctor, are making a scene. I suggest you return to your table and enjoy your truffles. They're likely the last ones you'll be eating for quite a long time. Mary was already 10 paces away, walking toward the private elevator at the back of the restaurant. John was waiting there, holding the doors open. Who does she think she is? Jane screamed after her, her voice cracking the sophisticated atmosphere of the restaurant. She's nothing. You hear me, Mary? You're nothing. Mary didn't turn back. As the elevator doors began to slide shut, she caught one final glimpse of Edward. He was standing in the middle of the restaurant, the $20 bill still fluttering on the table, looking suddenly very small and very confused in the center of his kingdom. The climax of his arrogance had been reached. Now, the descent was beginning. As the elevator descended toward the street, Mary felt a surge of professional warmth. It wasn't the heat of revenge, it was the satisfaction of a diagnosis confirmed. Did you get the footage, Mike? Mary asked. Mike tapped his phone. High definition, audio included. The selection committee will receive the clip of the future national chair screaming at a woman in a public restaurant by midnight. It's a textbook case of unprofessional conduct unbecoming of a physician. Good, Mary said. She looked at her reflection in the elevator's polished brass. The housekeeper was gone. The shadow was gone. The contrast is perfect, she whispered. He thinks he's at the top of the world. He doesn't realize he's just standing on the trapdoor. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. John, Mary said, stepping out into the cool night air. Call the board. I want the emergency meeting moved up to 8 a.m. I'm tired of waiting for the anesthesia to wear off. It's time to start the surgery. The boardroom of St. Jude's Medical Group was a chamber of cold glass and silent judgment, perched so high in the skyscraper that the clouds drifted past the windows like ethereal gauze. In the center sat a table of polished obsidian, surrounded by 12 leather chairs. 11 were occupied by the most powerful medical and financial minds in the state. The 12th chair, the one at the head of the table, remained empty. Diagnosis: acute systemic failure. Symptoms: overconfidence, lack of oversight, and terminal hubris. Prognosis: immediate decapitation of leadership. Edward entered the room at exactly 9 a.m. He didn't just walk, he processed. He was wearing a new, bespoke suit, and his hair was slicked back with a precision that mirrored his surgical ego. Behind him trailed a small army of lawyers and his ever-present shadow, Jane, who had insisted on witnessing his coronation. Good morning, gentlemen, Edward beamed, his voice echoing with the hollow resonance of a man who thought he had already won. He placed his gold-plated Mont Blanc pen on the obsidian table like a king laying down a scepter. I assume the contracts are ready for my signature? I have a busy schedule, a victory press conference at noon and a celebratory lunch with the senator. Dr. Miller, the acting board chair, looked uneasy. He kept glancing at the empty seat at the head of the table. Dr. Toke. Edward, there has been a slight change in the morning's agenda. Before the signing, we have a mandatory introduction to make. Edward chuckled, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. A new donor? Or perhaps a new hospital chaplain to bless my tenure. Make it quick, Miller. Time is money, and my time is now the most expensive in this building. Jane leaned over, whispering loudly enough for the room to hear, tell them to hurry up, Edward. We have a jewelry fitting at 1. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors at the far end of the room swung open. The sound was not a bang, but a sharp, pressurized hiss of hydraulics. A woman walked in. She was dressed in a midnight navy power suit that seemed to radiate its own gravity. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with the steady, rhythmic beat of a ticking clock. She held a single black leather folder in her hand. Edward's face underwent a fascinating physiological transformation. It went from a healthy, arrogant pink to a confused, sallow yellow. He burst into a loud, mocking laugh that bounced off the glass walls. Mary? Are you kidding me? Edward stood up, gesturing toward her as if she were a punchline. Security. How did this woman get past the lobby? I told you, she's my former housekeeper, and she's clearly suffered a mental break. Mary, if you've come here to beg for the house back, you're embarrassing yourself. Leave now, and I might not call the police. Mary didn't stop. She continued her walk toward the head of the table, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere behind Edward's head. Mary, I'm serious. Edward's voice rose to a shrill bark. Sit down or get out. You're interrupting a multi-million-dollar contract signing. You're a Dr. Bwangan, you don't belong in this room. You don't even belong in this building. Mary reached the head of the table. She didn't look at Edward. She looked at Dr. Miller. Good morning, everyone, she said. Her voice was low, melodic, and held a vibrational power that silenced Edward instantly. It was the voice of a commander returning to her post. The 11 board members stood up as if pulled by a single string. Good morning, Dr. Mary Toke, Dr. Miller said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and profound respect. Good morning, Chairwoman. Welcome back. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum before an explosion. Edward's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the obsidian table. The sound was like a gunshot. Chairwoman? What are you talking about? Miller, have you lost your mind? This is my wife. This is the woman who spends her days choosing curtain fabrics. Correction, Edward, Mary said, finally turning her gaze toward him. Her eyes were cold, blue, and utterly devoid of the warmth he had spent years extinguishing. I spent my days choosing which of your failures were worth fixing in the shadows. But today, I'm stepping into the light. She sat down in the 12th chair. The throne. Dr. Mary Toke is the primary heir to the Evergreen Foundation and the majority shareholder of St. Jude's Medical Group, Mike said, stepping out from the shadows behind the door, holding a thick stack of legal documents. She has been the silent chairwoman for the past 5 years. Every expansion, every acquisition, and every paycheck you've ever received, Edward, was personally authorized by her. Jane's jaw dropped so far it looked like a clinical dislocation. She's the boss? Mary opened her folder. Let's skip the pleasantries. Edward, you're here because you think you're signing a lifetime contract. You're right about one thing, it's a contract that will affect the rest of your life. But it's not an appointment. She slid a document across the obsidian table. It stopped precisely in front of him. This is a notice of summary dismissal, Mary said. And this, she slid a second, even thicker document, is a formal complaint for intellectual property theft and medical fraud. Edward stared at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. This is a joke. You can't do this. I'm the golden boy. I'm the Toke technique. The Toke technique is a stolen derivative of my private research, Edward, Mary said, her voice a sharp, surgical incision. I have the original manuscripts, the timestamps from your illegal access to my server, and the forensic data to prove you've never actually understood the mechanics of the procedure you claim to have invented. You're jealous. Edward screamed, his face turning a dark, necrotic purple. You're just a bitter woman trying to take credit for a man's success. I don't need to take credit for your success, Edward, Mary replied calmly. Because you haven't had any. Your mortality rates for the Toke technique are 12% higher than the national average. You've been hiding the complications by shuffling patients to subacute facilities. That ends today. She looked at the board. The motion to veto Dr. Edward Toka's appointment as National Chief of Surgery has already been passed. The motion to terminate his medical privileges at all Evergreen facilities is currently on the floor. All in favor? 11 hands went up instantly. Not a single person looked at Edward. The motion carries, Mary said. She looked back at Edward, who was now leaning against the table for support, his breathing shallow and rapid. You're fired, Edward. Not just from this hospital, but from the profession. Mike will walk you through the details of the lawsuit and the criminal referral for fraud. Mary stood up, her navy suit perfectly smooth. Security, she said, her voice echoing through the room. Please escort the former Dr. Toke and his guest from the premises. And make sure to take his badge. He won't be needing it where he's going. As the security guards moved in, Edward let out a sound, a high-pitched, desperate whimper that bore no resemblance to his former baritone. He looked at Mary, his eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying clarity. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his God. Mary, please. He whispered. It's Chairwoman Toke to you, Edward, Mary said, already turning her back on him to address the board. Now, let's discuss the real future of this hospital. The doors closed on Edward's screams, leaving the boardroom in a state of clinical peace. The housekeeper had finished her work. The room was finally clean. The atmosphere in the boardroom had shifted from a corporate meeting to a high-stakes clinical audit. Edward was no longer sitting at the table, he was standing near the glass wall, flanked by security, looking like a cornered animal. The golden boy was tarnished, his sweat soaking through his bespoke shirt. This is a vendetta. Edward shouted, his voice cracking. You're a biased observer, Mary. My research has been peer-reviewed. My presentation for the national chair is flawless. You're just looking for reasons to tear me down because you can't stand that I outshone you. Mary didn't rise to the bait. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned forward and tapped a command on the central haptic interface. A holographic display bloomed in the center of the table, the very heart of Edward's Toke technique presentation. Diagnosis, cognitive dissonance and intellectual fraud. Procedure, methodological dissection. Bias is a subjective variable, Edward, Mary said, her voice cool and rhythmic. I prefer to work with constants. Let's look at your centerpiece, the Toke shunt for pediatric pulmonary hypertension. She zoomed in on a complex 3D model of a human heart. The board members leaned in, their eyes darting between the digital organ and the woman controlling it. In your white paper, you claimed that a 45-degree angulation of the shunt minimizes turbulence and prevents postoperative thrombosis, Mary continued. She highlighted a specific junction in red. But let's look at the actual fluid dynamics. Mike, pull up the raw data from Edward's last 3 surgical simulations. A second screen appeared, showing a chaotic swirl of blue and red lines representing blood flow. As you can see, Mary said, pointing a laser-guided cursor at a swirling vortex of red, at a 45-degree angle, you aren't minimizing turbulence. You're creating a localized stasis zone. In a pediatric patient with high viscosity, this isn't a breakthrough. It's a time bomb. Within 6 hours of surgery, the shunt would clot, leading to immediate right-sided heart failure. That's a simulation error. Edward stammered. In the operating room, I make adjustments. I have his surgeon's intuition. Intuition is what you use when you haven't done the math, Edward, Mary countered. Her eyes flicked to the screen. In my original journals, the ones you accessed at 2:14 a.m. on March 14th, I specifically noted that the angle must be 32.5 degrees to account for the Reynolds number of infant blood flow. You changed it to 45 because, why? Because it was easier to sew? Because it looked prettier in the diagrams? Edward went silent. The board members began to murmur, their faces hardening. Without my shadow editing, as you called it, you don't even understand the basic physics of the organs you're cutting into, Mary said. She swiped to the next slide, showing a side-by-side comparison of Edward's published work and her private notes. Every successful surgery you've performed in the last year was based on my corrections. But for this national chair presentation, you decided to go it alone. You wanted to prove you didn't need me. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze a clinical searchlight. And in doing so, you designed a procedure that would have killed the senator's daughter tomorrow morning. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Dr. Miller looked as if he might be sick. Edward, is this true? Did you alter the measurements for ease of execution? Edward's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the holographic heart, the beautiful, flawed thing he had claimed as his own, and finally realized he couldn't read the map he had stolen. You're not a surgeon, Edward, Mary said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a falling guillotine. You're a technician who learned to mimic the movements of a master without ever understanding the music. You're a fraud, not because you stole my work, but because you were too arrogant to realize why the work was correct in the first place. She stood up, the holographic display flickering out, leaving the room in a sharp, cold light. I spent 5 years perfecting your reputation while you spent 5 years eroding your own soul, Mary said. I am not tearing you down, Edward. I am simply removing the scaffolding. You're the one who forgot you never built a foundation. She turned to Mike. The International Board of Surgeons is on the line. They've been watching this presentation via secure link. I believe they have seen enough to make a determination on his clinical competency. Wait. Edward screamed, lunging toward the table. Security caught him instantly, pinning his arms behind his back. Mary, don't do this. I'll give it all back. I'll tell them you did it. Just don't take my license. It's not mine to take, Edward, Mary said, her voice devoid of pity. The truth took it. I'm just the one who turned on the lights. She signaled to the security team. Take him to the holding room. The police are downstairs to discuss the falsification of medical records. And take the woman with him. Jane, who had been trying to blend into the wallpaper, shrieked as a guard took her arm. I didn't do anything. I'm just a patient. You're an accessory to a fraud, Jane, Mary said without looking at her. And as for your surgery? I've cancelled it. I don't allow malpractice in my hospital. As the doors closed on Edward's desperate pleas, Mary sat back down. She felt a profound sense of intellectual peace. The tumor had been dissected. The margins were clean. Chairwoman, Dr. Miller said, his voice shaky. What happens now? The national chair position is empty, and the press is waiting. Mary looked at her hands, steady, capable, and finally free. Now, Mary said, we tell the truth. And then, I'm going to go to the OR. I have a 32.5-degree shunt to sew. The security office in the basement of St. Jude's was a stark contrast to the mahogany-lined boardroom. Here, the walls were reinforced concrete, the air smelled of ozone and cheap coffee, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency buzz that felt like a migraine in the making. Edward sat on a metal folding chair, his bespoke suit looking like a costume from a play that had just been cancelled. He was shivering, though the room wasn't cold. Diagnosis: acute social and financial necrosis. Symptoms: rapid loss of status, involuntary tremors, and the realization of total obsolescence. Prognosis: incurable. The door opened, and Mike walked in, carrying a leather briefcase that looked more like a coffin for Edward's future. He was followed by Mary, who stood by the door, her presence radiating a clinical coldness that made the room feel like a morgue. I want my lawyer, Edward rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. You have one, Edward, Mike said, placing a thick stack of papers on the table with a heavy thud. But he's currently on the phone with the district attorney, trying to explain why he shouldn't be charged as a co-conspirator in your embezzlement schemes. I'm here to read you your professional obituary. Mike didn't wait for a response. He opened the folder and began to read, his voice as flat and lethal as a heart rate monitor after a code blue. Count 1, systematic research fraud and intellectual property theft involving the TOC technique. Count 2, falsification of medical records to hide postoperative mortality rates. Count 3, embezzlement of foundation funds totaling $4.2 million over 5 years. Edward's head snapped up. Embezzlement? That was my compensation. I brought in the donors. You brought in donors using Mary's research, Mike countered. And you used the hospital's emergency research fund to pay for Jane's penthouse in the city and a fleet of luxury cars. That's not compensation, Edward. That's grand larceny. Mary stepped forward, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. She didn't look angry, she looked like a lead pathologist explaining a particularly obvious cause of death. But the money is the least of your problems, Edward, Mary said. She pulled a single, gold-embossed envelope from her pocket. The International Board of Surgeons just finished their emergency review. As of 10 minutes ago, your medical license has been placed under permanent revocation for gross ethical violations and clinical incompetence. The air seemed to leave the room. Edward's hands began to shake violently. To a man like him, the license wasn't just a permit to work, it was his identity, his shield, his very soul. Without it, he wasn't Dr. Edward Toke. He was just a man with an expensive suit and a mountain of debt. Permanent? Edward whispered. No, they can't. I can appeal. I can go to a private clinic. I have connections in Europe. You had connections, Edward, Mary said. But you've forgotten who owns the bridge. She nodded to Mike, who slid a final document across the table. It was a map of the country, covered in a spiderweb of red dots. The Evergreen Foundation doesn't just own St. Jude's, Mike explained. Through our various subsidiaries and partnerships, we own or manage 40% of the private hospital beds in this country. And the other 60%? They rely on our insurance clearinghouse and our pharmaceutical supply chain. What does that mean? Jane asked, speaking for the first time. She had been sitting in the corner, clutching her gold clutch as if it were a life preserver. Mary turned to her, her eyes flashing with a brief, cold spark of amusement. It means, Jane, that I have just activated the global non-compete and blacklist protocol. Every hospital, every clinic, every boutique plastic surgery center that wants to stay in business with the Evergreen Foundation has just received a memo. If they hire Edward Toke, even as a janitor, they lose their funding, their insurance, and their accreditation. Edward stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. You're blackballing me? Nationwide? That's illegal. That's a monopoly. It's a quality control measure, Mary replied. I'm protecting the public from a defective product. You're a liability, Edward. No one wants to touch a surgeon whose pioneering technique is a fraud and whose hands are a hazard. You're not just fired. You're erased. The silence that followed was broken by a sharp, metallic sound. It was Jane, standing up and smoothing her dress. She didn't look at Edward. She looked at the door. Wait, Jane, Edward reached out for her. We can get through this. I still have the offshore accounts, we can move to the islands. Offshore accounts? Mike interrupted with a dry chuckle. The IRS froze those 20 minutes ago based on our forensic audit. You're currently $3 million in the red, Edward. Your house is being seized, your cars are being towed, and your bank accounts have a balance of exactly 0. Jane recoiled from Edward's touch as if his hand were a necrotic limb. 0? She looked at Edward, really looked at him, without the filters of fame and fortune. She saw a middle-aged man with a sweaty face and a desperate, pathetic gaze. The golden boy was gone. In his place was a bankrupt fraud. I'm a patient, Jane said, her voice turning cold and sharp. I was told I was being treated by the best. It turns out I was being used as a prop in a scam. Jane, baby, please. Edward begged. Don't baby me, Jane snapped. She turned to Mary, a calculating look in her eyes. Dr. Toke, chairwoman, I wanted on the record that I had no idea about his financial crimes. I was a victim of his manipulation. I'm happy to testify against him if it means protecting my own reputation. Edward looked at her, his mouth hanging open. Jane? You're turning on me? After everything I bought you? You bought me things with her money, Edward, Jane said, gesturing toward Mary. That makes you a thief, and it makes the gift stolen property. I don't stay with thieves. It's bad for my brand. She turned to Mary and gave a small, practiced nod. I'll have my agent call your legal team. I assume my surgery is still cancelled? Correct, Mary said. And Jane. Security will escort you to the curb. Your belongings at the manor have already been placed in the trash bins on the street. I suggest you get there before the morning pickup. Jane didn't wait. She walked out of the room without a backward glance, the click of her heels sounding like a final, mocking applause. Edward collapsed back into the chair. He looked like a man who had survived a crash only to realize he was bleeding out. She left, Edward whispered. Just like that. She was a symptom of your disease, Edward, Mary said. She walked to the table and picked up the gold pen he had dropped in the boardroom. She tucked it into her pocket. And now the fever has broken. What do I do? Edward looked up at her, his eyes hollow. I have nothing. I am nothing. That's the most accurate diagnosis you've ever made, Mary said. She turned to Mike. Have security hand him over to the police. I believe they're waiting in the lobby. As Mary walked toward the door, Edward let out a desperate, strangled cry. Mary. How can you be so cold? We were married for 5 years. Doesn't that mean anything? Mary stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. It means I know exactly where to cut to ensure the tumor doesn't grow back, she said. The door closed with a heavy, final thud.